Thank you for coming here today. Welcome to Mission Ready Podcast. I'm delighted to have our special guest, Tom Lampley. Tom is the Vice President for Marketing and External Affairs for KBR Government Solutions. I've known Tom for a very long time, and he's very involved in the logistics space, and we're really happy to have you, Tom.
Pleasure to be here, Chris. First of all, thank you for having this program that Planet has put on to interview different people as a kind of a recorded history. I think it's a great opportunity, and I'm honored that you've asked me to come and join you for this.
You know, Tom, I've met you a long time ago, but it was after you got out of the military. Can you talk about a little bit of your background from when you went to the academy and then how it transpired?
First of all, I guess I should preface by saying that any comments that I make here are strictly mine. I'm not speaking on behalf of KBR. This is strictly my opinion about things, so please don't construe anything that I say as being KBR's position on anything. So you asked me about what kind of led me into this career field, and I guess some of the milestones I guess I'd start with in kind of understanding where I'm coming from is, first of all, my parents had a great to-do with shaping my opinions. My father was an Air Force officer, West Point graduate. My mother was a daughter of Army Air Corps and Air Force father. So I've got a whole lineage of being associated with the Air Force. I started out kind of understanding what it was like to be in the military because I moved all over the place with my father. Looking back on my career and the time with my father, I think I had over 20 moves in 29 years. So I quickly had to learn to adjust to changing environments, meeting new people, that sort of thing. I actually grew up in Mexico, so I was in a foreign country when I was just a year old. And when I came back to the United States, I didn't speak English and I failed first grade. So that's a little bit of the background that kind of taught me a different language, a different culture early on, and learning how to deal with something different than your normal surroundings. I decided to go to the Air Force, to West Point. My father had gone there. I always thought that was a great idea. I thought that was something that I wanted to do. I did, but I also wanted to fly. And so when I graduated from West Point at the time, they allowed 33 of us to transfer into the Air Force from the Army, from West Point. And that opened up a lot of flying opportunities for me, which I really enjoyed, and took me all over the world doing that sort of thing. I was very fortunate in my military career to have such a diverse background. I did things from staff jobs to flying jobs to working for the Defense Logistics Agency. The Air Force sent me to work for Westinghouse for a year on an education with industry program. In the contracting business, I went to work for DLA in the contracting side of the house. And at that time, I thought my career was over because I went from flying to going with the vice director of DLA out to pick food, squeezing tomatoes for buying subsistence for the Department of Defense. I thought, what am I doing at 3 a.m. squeezing a tomato? How is this ever going to help my career? So I mentioned that only in that it was a very broadening experience, and I certainly didn't follow the normal career path in terms of just sticking in the flying business. And so that opened up a lot of opportunities for a varied background. Ended up with 3 tours at the Pentagon, and the last one was working for the Secretary of the Air Force doing congressional liaison. So that bit of a military background are kind of the milestones that led me to where I am at now. After I got out, then I went to work for at that time, Johnson Controls. I worked for a private security company, and now I've been with KBR for about 15 years.
When you were a fighter pilot, right? Is that?
Well, if a fighter, we call him was a weapon systems officer, sort of a co-pilot in the F-4.
And so you had a lot of missions in Vietnam. Was that your heyday?
Yeah, at 236 combat missions in Vietnam over 2 years.
So you saw a lot of challenges with that, huh?
Yeah, there were, but I was very young. I was a first lieutenant, second lieutenant. I guess maybe first or second. I think I pinned on first lieutenant while I was over there. So you're young, fearless, not smart enough to be scared, and doing probably the most exciting thing I've ever done in my life. So it was a very, very interesting experience.
So your military experience ended up doing government affairs, right, towards the end there?
Right. My last job in the Air Force was was actually doing liaison with Congress. So I helped prepare the Secretary and the Chief of Staff of the Air Force for testimony on Capitol Hill, and preparing them for the types of questions that had to be answered. And that often entailed getting to know the members and their staff as to what kind of questions might come up, and doing the best we could to prepare both those Chief of Staff and Secretary of the Air Force for answering these questions.
Was that your intent as a transition job, to seek that?
I guess it was in the back of my mind to be able to do that. I thought that might be, I wasn't going to go back into the flying business at that stage.
I see.
And I was looking for something that I thought would have some continuity into the commercial world to help me find a job after I retired.
So your transition was pretty smooth.
It was. I was very fortunate to have been able to have a smooth transition. I got hired by Johnson Controls at the time in the business development side of the house, because they were looking for someone who had experience running installations, because at that time the Department of Defense was contracting out a lot of the commercial services. Instead of doing it in-house with the military,
Right.
They used contractors to do those things that weren't inherently governmental. And so contractors were being used for that, and Johnson Controls at the time was really big in the base operations support. That was one part of Johnson Controls, part that I was in, on the facilities management. So they were looking for somebody with that kind of a background, and after having been a base commander at 2 different installations, they saw that, and of course understanding how the Pentagon works, I think was the reasons I was able to get hired. So it turned out to be a smoother transition than I thought it'd be. I was very fearful leaving the Air Force, having done nothing but been associating with the military my whole life, to move into the commercial world. But fortunately, it worked out very smoothly.
Eventually you get to KBR, and you're doing logistics for them as well. Is it related to your military experience or not?
Well, it is more directly with the work I did, and not as a flyer, but as a base commander. So I was able to see from the government side of the house what they needed to have done, because these are the functions that I was responsible for, running a base, understanding the logistics, the civil engineering, the supply, the warehousing, all those kind of support functions I was responsible for. And so it gave me an understanding from that side of the house. Now I was seeing it from the contractor side.
And I guess that directly relates to what your companies do now.
Absolutely.
And do you find that the way they did business in the old days is very similar to the business now, or how has it changed in your mind?
I don't know that the contracting out of these functions has changed much. I think they still are looking for those core functions to contract out, simply because they want to be able to, they being the government, the military, have become so dependent on defense contractors to sustain them for any extended period of time, especially overseas, that they use contractors to be able to build up quickly when something happens where we have to deploy forward. And by the same token, when they don't need us anymore, they can quickly scale down and just get rid of us. Whereas if it were military, you'd have to keep all these people around, you'd have to pay for retirements, medical care, and all those others. Contracting it out gives them the flexibility of building up and just equally coming down as fast.
Did you see a lot of contractors in Vietnam back then compared to today, or not so much?
Well, not so much in Vietnam, simply because it was in a wartime environment. So most of the functions that were being done there were done by the military, loading aircraft and maintaining the aircraft, and taking care of the facilities and stuff were done primarily through the civil engineers, but I suspect I didn't pay much attention to it as a second lieutenant or first lieutenant, that they may have had contractors that are doing some of that work too. But it's become much more prevalent today than it was in the past.
Yeah, because if it was today, there'd be contractors in those functions.
Absolutely.
Right? And so what's your thought of the challenges for contractors today compared to then in taking these functions on?
Not much has changed in that regard. It's still work that the military needs. We still have to develop and win contracts. So from the commercial side of the house, doing business development and being able to bid and win these contracts is always a challenge because there's so many companies out there. And you, as the chairman of the board for ISOA, are keenly aware of all the competition there is in exactly this career field that I'm talking about, doing base operations support. You got Amentum, you got Floor, you got V2X. And the competition's pretty keen now, so the taxpayers are getting a pretty good bang for the buck when it comes to the services that they get
I think that's
for
true.
the taxpayers' dollars.
So do you think defense readiness is better now because they've outsourced a lot of these functions?
Well, yes, as long as the government prepares the industry to be able to respond to it. And maybe we'll get into it a little bit later, but you look at a theater like the Pacific, where you've got the tyranny of distance and contested logistics, which is something that the United States has not really had to contend with in years because of all of the fights that we've had no problems getting supplies and equipment into where the warfighter was. Fighting something over in the South China Sea is an entirely different challenge. To the extent that the government can give us better insights as to what their needs are going to be in the future, will help contractors prepare to be able to respond to them. I think a lack of true understanding by the military on how contractors work. I think there's still an assumption that when the government issues a contractors will figure out how to get there, and they'll figure out what to do. But in the case of the Pacific, we'll be competing with the government for limited supplies of shipment, limited aircraft. If we haven't thought through, we as a government haven't thought through how we're going to pre-position equipment to get it over there, so we're not dealing with this contested logistics, having ships trying to get over there while they're being fired on. So that's the challenge, and a lot of it is going to be educating the government on what our limitations are, we contractors, what our limitations are, and being able to support them.
I guess the issue is things are more rapid too, right? In this environment, things have to move much quicker than they used to.
Yeah, it'll have to move much faster. So we're always looking for better and more innovative ways of delivering services to the military.
What do you think about what the military is doing? We see exercises occurring now where contractors are invited. We're burying contractors in their planning process now. Is that helping, you think? Or?
Absolutely it is. But not all the services are embedding contractors into their planning. Army has done a pretty good job under LOGCAP, where we do have embedded planners that are part of the government's planning process, where contractors are being coordinated to a certain point. The more they do that, the better prepared contractors are going to be to respond. But the Air Force and the Navy, in my opinion, have not done as good a job of keeping contractors embedded in their operations or planning cycles. And as you know, Chris, from many of these tabletop exercises that we've had in Indo-PACOM, the Joint Staff is coming to the realization that they have not been given enough consideration to the contractors' involvement in this and getting them built into their war plans. They'll say, well, contractors will be there to support us, and that's about the extent of the planning. They're not built into the tip-fiddle planning on how they're going to deploy contractors forward or get supplies moved forward. And I think that's one thing that ISOA has done a very good job of, is letting the Joint Staff come to a better understanding of our limitations without better guidance from them. I think the easy answer, the first thing that jumps to my mind, is that the government, I think, is looking to contractors to be innovative and to come up with ideas. They've got problems, and they look to us to figure out how to solve them for them. And contractors are known for doing that. Small businesses are known for doing that, for being very innovative, very flexible in their response. I think the government is trying to tap into that creativity by bringing in some of the more innovative ideas from small businesses, getting the Silicon Valley folks to bid on some of our contracts to help us find quicker, faster ways of getting things done. And I think it's going to end up having to be some sort of a joint cooperative effort where the government is not going to just write a requirement, throw it out there, and hope somebody will bid it. I think there's going to have to be more collaboration between the requirements guys and the contractor, working more collaboratively in the process, which is very difficult to do under our normal rules, simply because of the fear of giving one contractor more information than another. But I think ultimately we're going to have to find some way to get to that point, to work more collaboratively together, to be able to transfer some of that innovation to the government, to tell them what might be the best way of doing it.
Yeah, I agree with you. It seems like they're trying. I mean, we see things called OTAs that allow contractors to tell the government how they can develop their requirements. And it allows for single sourcing, but it's mostly for smaller firms. I think it's not large firms like yours that could solve big problems.
That's correct.
They don't take the risks. So I don't see much change there over the years. It's been pretty consistent, putting the requirement out, having us bid it, and then they live with it.
I think ultimately that process is going to have to change a little bit to be able to be as responsive as we need to be. We've come up with OTAs, other contracting authorities, that I think is open the door to that sort of thing. I think the military is trying to take advantage of those contracting opportunities to do that. I think they want to take a little more risks and to try something new and fail early, correct it and figure out how to get it done, because some of the processes that we're using now take years from the requirement being generated before anything actually happens in the field. And we've got to find a faster way of doing that.
You're seeing the acquisition reforms coming out now, and they're going to start stripping away all those socioeconomic requirements, a lot of the confusing FAR requirements that have been added. So I'm hopeful too that things will change. Let's hope for the best.
They've got to, if we're going to be responsive, and our adversaries don't have those limitations, and that's something that we've got to come to the realization, that we can't fight in a battle where our opponents have faster, quicker ways of getting things done, and we get bogged down in some large bureaucratic process before we can bring any fire to bear on the field.
Yeah, unfortunately, I guess when we talk about Indo-PACOM, that's exactly what's happening, right? We're seeing large developments in Tinian and perhaps in Palau, and these are all being delayed and impacted for whatever reasons on the timelines. So you're right, we probably need to fix a lot of those issues. What's your thoughts on us being so far away that we have to be in a host nation to conduct work, especially with contractors in a host nation supporting the U.S. military? Does that present additional challenges in your experience, and how did you guys handle that in the past?
Well, I don't think we dealt with it too much in the past in terms of developing it. We are going to have to be more dependent on, especially in the Pacific, of some of the host nations to be able to provide some support there, but we don't want to have to be too dependent on that. And I think you correctly pointed out in an earlier conversation that many of the host countries that we consider allies, or that we are going to depend on in the case of the South China Sea blow up, is that they're reluctant to show too much favoritism to the U.S. because they're going to anger China. So they're playing a very delicate game here of being supportive of the U.S. operations, but they don't want to appear to be too supportive of it, but they also want the protections of the U.S. if China starts creating some problems for them. So we can't get them to fully embrace, all of them, to fully embrace what we're doing in the Philippines is a great example. We're trying to make a lot of inroads there in terms of joint use bases in the Philippines, but they've got to be a little careful about being too overt about it and doing a lot of exercises with U.S. there, because it's going to impact their very strong economic relationships with China.
So what's your thoughts, though, on, I mean, originally there was a belief that we would pivot to the Pacific years ago under President Obama, and we were going to exit certain markets for defense, but it seems like we're continuing in CENTCOM. We know what Iran's going on now, and areas in Africa are quite busy, very difficult. Do you see a way that they'll be able to shift resources and not allocate our defense all over the world, or how do you see this going?
Well, it seems to be done in fits and starts. We say we're going to do it, we start doing it, And then something else blows up. Ukraine becomes a problem. All of a sudden, well, not so fast. We've got some issues to take care of here. And if we able to solve that problem, then we've got the Middle East blowing up again, with our bombing of Iran and Israel's involvement over there. So still a lot of unsettled issues there in the Middle East that we're not going to be able to walk away from quite yet. So it can take a little bit of time. But I do see more things happening in the Pacific, budgetary-wise. I think there's starting to be a pretty good move. Right now, I think the most obvious things are on the military construction side of the house.
Yeah.
These long lead items to build up bases or whatever. I mean, rebuilding the runway in Tinian is a good example there. I mean, they're investing a lot of money. That old World War II base used to bomb Japan now is getting revitalized. So they're investing money there, and they're investing money in Guam. So I think there's definitely a movement, just looking at the budget, to the Pacific. And it's pretty obvious, I think, to most people that the pacing threat is going to be China. But we can't walk away from what's happening in the Middle East and in Europe.
Yeah. When you talk about the logistics changes and then infrastructure, this idea of going from permanent fixed infrastructure where we run the base and own the base to leased facilities to expeditionary solutions, it seems like logistics is changing in some regards. Do you have any opinion on why we went from the traditional fixed bases to more of a flexible solution?
I think it's a smart thing to do from the standpoint of our countries. Let's take Europe, for example, and Romania and Lithuania, Estonia, Poland. None of those countries want permanent U.S. bases there. But they've allowed us to use bases in their countries on a warm base, kind of like a lily pad, and contractors will maintain those bases and then will rotate units through there for exercises and training. So we've got somewhat of a permanent presence, but it's a rotational permanent presence. So there's always somebody there, but we don't have any permanent basing there. So that seems to be more acceptable to our allies over there than us building a big base and calling it a U.S. base in Romania or in Lithuania or in Poland. And we're also trying to get the countries themselves to start investing in that infrastructure that we can joint use. I think we're starting to see that in the Philippines as well, where some of the bases that are being upgraded a little bit in the Philippines are intended for a joint use. We won't have any permanent presence there at all, but with the understanding that if push came to shove and we had to use those bases, they would allow us in there to some extent, and who knows what. But it's that dual use aspect of it. It's less expensive for us. We don't have to have people permanently stationed over there. So it's kind of a win-win operation, in my opinion.
Is that different than what they did 20 years ago, 30 years ago?
Well, they still did that. I mean, when I was stationed flying F-4s in Germany, we had permanent bases, but we also had, like when I was at Ramstein, we had 2 fighter squadrons there. But we also had facilities there for another couple of fighter squadrons that would rotate on an annual basis. They'd come over, spend a month or 2 there during exercises, and then rotate back, because these are the units that had been earmarked to come over in case the balloon goes up. So they had an opportunity to come and practice in that arena that they'd be fighting in, but they weren't there permanently. So we only kept 2 squadrons there. But when we surged, we'd have 4 squadrons there or more. I can't remember, 3. There might be a total of 5 of them when they surged.
What's your experience on those types of bases and logistics when you have third country nationals working for you as a U.S. contractor in their country supporting U.S. military? What's your experience on how you work those cultural things? Because you guys do that all over the world.
It's the right thing to do in terms of nation building, because it employs their people, and that makes us more desirable to be there. We've been talking about closing bases in Germany, and everybody's screaming bloody murder over there because, oh my God, you can't pull the Americans out of here. We depend on them economically. It's like closing in a base in the United States. Nobody wants to close it because the whole economy around that base is dependent on them. So it makes sense from that perspective. 2, it's typically a cheaper labor force than if we sent Americans over to do the same thing, especially over in the Middle East. if you employ the local nationals there. It's less expensive than if you had all U.S. personnel there. But that also requires you to ensure you understand their culture, their norms. You've got to be more sensitive to the fact that you're living in somebody else's country, and you got to abide by their labor laws. And so that makes it a little more complex in terms of how you hire people, or whether you directly hire them, or whether you subcontract out the labor. So you have to work that very carefully.
As I recall, one of the challenges that you've seen over your career is tax implications in all these countries for U.S. contracts, right?
That's exactly right. So in many of the countries that we operate in, they're under the Status of Forces Agreement. And under the Status of Forces Agreement, in most cases, U.S. Contractors that are deployed in support of the military are exempt from taxes, import duties, that sort of thing, if the country fully complies with that. Now, we've had problems in the past, Afghanistan in particular, where the country would not necessarily recognize that, and they would try to impose additional taxes on defense contractors that were over there. And that becomes a bit of a problem, because then you've got a contractor trying to resolve this issue as a contractor to a nation state. And the nation state, it's got all the power, right? So without the contractors getting the U.S. government involved on their behalf to kind of get them to comply with the Status of Forces Agreement, it becomes a challenge, and that's something contractors have to take on. That's obviously one of those things that ISOA has been very helpful to us in the past in helping not only KBR, but everybody in this business operating overseas, to get the U.S. government to engage with the foreign governments and get them to comply with these rules and regulations, so that we can continue to support. When we bid, it did not include paying these taxes.
Does that always work out generally, that the government will take action?
Well,
to
for the
solve
most
these problems?
part, but there's still some ongoing issues that haven't been resolved yet, and that's going to end up being up to the lawyers to figure out how to do that. But it's
typically it's in the government's interest to resolve these, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so you've been in large businesses since you left in the Air Force. Large business is different than small, that you have risk managers and lots of compliance processes. Do you find that affects your judgment in terms of what work you pursue and how you do logistics work in this field?
You mean a difference between how a large contractor would operate versus
Yeah,
a small
because
one?
you have a lot more rules and compliance. You have risk managers that are evaluating risks on contracts, and you are operating in some risky locations. So do you find that process is useful or difficult, or do you recommend risk management, or what's your thoughts on it?
When you're a large contractor, yeah, you've got to be very careful about that, because you've got stakeholders, your shareholders, and you've got to be very careful that you're not going to do anything that is going to jeopardize what your investors thought they were getting into when they bought stock in that company. So you've really got to, risk management is obviously a key consideration. I think small businesses are equally concerned about it, but they may be less concerned because they don't have as deep a pocket as the big guys, and so the big guys are more liable for huge amounts of litigation. I don't know that it's significantly different, but it does, because the dollar volume, the size of these contracts are so much bigger.
Well, it's true too.
Much larger
because I've noticed
liability.
The bigger firms, it takes them longer to decide to go after things, and they have all these gates that they hit. Even right up to the very end, they're still evaluating if this is a pursuit or not a pursuit. And I wondered often if, since you're working in some of these difficult locations, does all that play into those decisions?
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, it does, even for a big firm.
Yeah, you got to weigh all those considerations. Navy wanted us to take over the contract and assume liability for the burn pits, and we have no idea what was in there for the 20 years before us as to what might have been put in there, what residual toxic materials might be there, and we don't want to accept that liability. So to the extent that we can, we want to be indemnified for anything that happened prior to our being there. But the Navy typically says, no, if you got the contract, you assume the full liability. And so we had to work those things out to our satisfaction before we could do it.
Yeah, it's a good point. I don't know how they do it. So is liability exposure just the performance of the contract, or is it sometimes extend past the performance?
Yeah, I don't know
how that goes.
I don't know how the legalities. I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but our lawyers look at this and they're very concerned about making sure that we don't take on anybody else's liability.
So what do you think the big challenges are going forward, especially for Indo-Pacific or CENTCOM? How do you see our industry changing?
Well, the big driver in this is great power competition. So Europe, it's Russia. And in China, in the Pacific, obviously, it's China. And both those countries are trying to establish their own hegemony. They want control of their area, no different than what the U.S. wants. The United States would not tolerate having Russia build a missile base in South America somewhere or in Mexico any more than China really wants us interfering and building bases in their backyard. They want to have control of the South China Sea. We, the West, do not want China to be able to control it because it's such an important thoroughfare of shipping throughout the world. Same thing over in the Middle East, the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. We don't want Iran to be able to dominate that. And so the U.S. national interest is making sure that those countries that could possibly impact free travel through those areas don't ever have the power to close everything down. So it's in our national interest to make sure these waterways are free and clear.
Well, but if you look 5 to 10 years, that's a lot of requirements you just described, right? That we traditionally didn't do in a defense budget that's flat, basically, right? So what do you think would have to change? What are we going to do differently to cover all these bases?
Well, a lot of it's being done by allies. We're depending more and more on allies, especially in the Pacific. We got AUKUS, we got the Australians, we got South Korea, Philippines to some extent, Japan. Those relationships are going to be more and more important. We may be more and more dependent on them for supplies, for the supply chain, because we're not going to ship stuff all the way from the United States over there, especially in a contested logistic environment. We're going to have to come up with more innovative ways of utilizing those countries to be able to pre-position equipment if necessary.
So you think we would have logistics contracts in the future that would include foreign nation support, or would we use their vehicles to support us?
I don't know that I have any real crystal ball on it, but I think it's more than just in the services side of the house. Like, are we going to have co-production in the United States? Are we going to have South Korea building ships in the United States? Or are we going to be building ships in South Korea or Japan or any other place? I think in the end, there'll have to be some of that, because I don't know that we could build up our own ship industry fast enough to compete with what China's putting out. So even if we wanted to, and even if we put the money into it, it would take years to get that infrastructure built to where we could be able to produce. So I think we're going to have to find some ways of working with our allies for increasing our capacity to build ships.
One of the other things you kind of implied was this idea that the public and private sectors need to work closer together. I suspect you see that changing going forward.
I think I can see where public and private are going to work more closely, collaboratively, in trying to find solutions to problems, instead of, like I said, RFP coming out where the government says, this is what we want. Because oftentimes I don't think they necessarily know. Well, I think they know what they want, but they don't necessarily know how to get there. And typically these contracts tend to be pretty prescriptive on, you will do this, 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 and this to get to what we want. But industry says, well, there are a lot better ways of doing it, but that doesn't always get built into the RFP.
Well, so step back to the legislative processes that you worked before you left the Air Force and then now government affairs duties. How do you see legislation and how does it affect our industry? What trends are you seeing in that? Has it changed much over the years?
I guess my first exposure was when I was with education with industry, when I was working for Westinghouse. They took us down to attend several hearings, and it was eye-opening for me as a captain, I guess I was at the time, to go to a hearing and see how legislators beat up these four-star generals. I thought, oh my God, these are gods, and these members of Congress are beating them up, And I thought, wow, well, it's a sure sign of civilian leadership here. Yeah. And then later in life, when I was right before I retired, working for the Secretary of the Air Force, I started to realize it's not just the needs of the military that dictate where the money goes, that you got to get members of Congress to buy into it, and to get them to buy into it, it's got to be what's right for their districts. And so I realized the only way you got a major program through the system is you had to have pieces of that aircraft, ship, whatever, built in every state in the union to get everybody to agree to do this. And so it wasn't just a matter of knowing what's needed and then asking for the money. You had to build a case understanding the priorities of the members of Congress that are going to be voting on it. And if it's not going into their district, they're not as supportive of it as someone whose district was going to be positively impacted by that development.
Was there policies over the years or legislative initiatives that you really saw help the logistics industry that we're in? Is there any relationship between what's coming out of Congress and directly as it's implemented?
For major weapon systems like the F-35, I mean that's one that she is huge in terms of where it's built and all the people involved. In that case, it's international because we also had to have parts of it built with all the countries that were buying it. We had the Danish, we had the Italians, we had the Germans, and they all had a stake in it. So they wanted to make sure that some of their people were being used and their factories were being put to work in developing the aircraft. So,
what about technology? When you think of new technologies with logistics, with contractors in support of them, the military in the field, are you seeing any changes in the industry in the last 20, 30 years?
Yeah, I think so. I think industry is really trying to be more innovative. I think they're trying to find ways of employing AI, trying to find, cyber's a big deal, and that's a whole industry in itself. All these technologies associated with this and data analytics, all that is what is going to help drive down cost, even in the base operations side of the house. If you've got a way of crunching the numbers on maintenance of facilities, for instance, or maintenance of vehicles, instead of just complying with the manufacturer's recommended oil changes or whatever, you use some analytics to determine when does it really need to be done. Can you do it less often and save money? And you got predictive analysis that go out there. And if you can collect enough data points on the condition of equipment, whether it's an air conditioner or a reused spaceship, if you collect enough data on that, you can find more efficient ways of maintaining it. And I think the government's looking to industry to help them understand that. But sometimes from the industry's perspective, the government doesn't necessarily know how to evaluate innovations. So they may say we want innovations, but when you bid it, sometimes these innovations, which have a long-term cost benefit, aren't readily apparent to the evaluators, and they tend to sometimes discount that. And they'll say, no, this is smoke and mirrors, and we don't want it. So we're going to be very prescriptive about it. So you can try to be innovative until they really embrace that concept or know how to evaluate it, so that they can give credit in the evaluation process of those that are truly coming up with some innovative ideas.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, have you seen, from your experience, leadership in the military versus leadership in civilian industry? Is it interchangeable, leaders in both, or what's your experience?
Yeah, that's a real good question. My experience in the military, I was very fortunate to always have good leaders. I didn't really have a bad leader in my entire time in the career. I can't ever say he was bad or she was bad. They were all. I was very fortunate to be under great leadership. The leadership there was driven toward accomplishing a mission. They were very mission focused. It wasn't financially focused. I mean, what is it going to take us to get this mirror, provide this protection, or get this bomb on the target? On the commercial side, there's still that same characteristics of leadership, but it being driven by, it sounds terrible to say it, driven by profit, but it's a financially driven organization. You're bidding very competitively on items. Cost is a very important factor, and in the end, you got to be able to make money. And so the leadership is driving people to find economies. And so the financial people in the industries really have a lot of input into what's going on. So I think a lot of your leaders in the commercial side of the house come from the financial background. You know, they understand the money side of the house. But the leadership's still the same characteristics of any good leader. You know, you got to be trustworthy, bold. You've got to be reliable. You've got to be honest. You have to have integrity. The same sort of characteristics are there. They're just, in my opinion, they're just displayed a little bit differently. I mean, even within the military, you find different kinds of leadership. You've got examples that I learned when I was at West Point. You got the George Patton's, blood and guts. And then you got the Omar Bradley, the soldiers general. You got the Eisenhower, who never commanded a combat unit in his whole career, and yet he led the D-Day invasion. He was a great staff officer. I mean, he was a great coordinator with all the multi-nations that were involved in it. I mean, that's an entirely different kind of leadership. And then on the civilian side, I mean, I read a book about Elon Musk, and he said, I want a fire-breathing CEO. Take charge and move out. You know, I mean, he was just a gun-ho kind of a guy. And you can see how sometimes that works in industry, but doesn't always work in government. So it's different. But in the end, I think the most successful leaders on both sides of the house, the military or commercial, have been people who have adopted their leadership style to their own personalities. I mean, I could never be a George Patton. I could never be an Elon Musk. I might be able to be an Eisenhower or an Omar Bradley. You know, you got to find the right leadership style for yourself and make it work. I know Machiavelli, who wrote Prince, said, it's better for a good leader to be feared than loved, unless he can be both. So a lot of people decide, well, do I want to be loved or I want everybody shaking their boots to get things done? And I think both styles of leadership can work. The former, you can't keep it up forever if you're being feared. It's great when you come in and you want to take over an organization that really needs to get cleaned up and reorged, but you can't keep that up forever because you're going to burn your people out. And you can't just be loved all the time because sometimes there's some very tough decisions that have to be made. And you've got to be able to adapt to both styles depending on what the requirement calls for.
Well, thanks, Tom.
And I've seen it in both military and commercial.
Tom, it concludes my thoughts today. Is there anything you would like to talk about that we haven't discussed?
As I said at the very beginning, I applaud you for taking the time and effort to put these together. I think it's great to bring in some of the old graybeards to talk a little bit about what they learned along the way, I guess would be a good way of putting it. You know, life's experiences and what got you to where you are today. And everybody had a different path that they followed to get to where they were. But everything I learned by watching other people. I'm a great observer of other people. And I watch what works for some people and doesn't work for people and try to figure out what's the best of these and which of these traits and anything I can pass on to anybody else in that regard. I think I'd like to be able to do it, and I'm glad that you're bringing people in to have them talk about their experiences as well.
Yeah, I mean, we want to document experiences in our industry because I think there's not many people that are talking about that in our space. takes many, many years to understand what the stuff we do. And this is an opportunity for it to be for history.
You mean as contractors?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's important, because oftentimes contractors get a bad name because they don't understand exactly how everything works. Yes, we're driven by profits, but I think you find that to scratch the surface, especially in any of the defense contractors, a vast majority of the people in them are former military people and veterans, and they typically have a very strong work ethic, and they're trying to do what's right for the nation. They understand the budgetary constraints and the profit motivation, but they also come from backgrounds where they know the mission comes first, and they're going to do everything they can to make it right. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Thanks for being here. Thank you for another episode of Mission Readiness.